Welcome to the Roots of the Spirit podcast. I'm your host, Spirit Tawfiq. I'm a social justice passionista and daughter of the civil rights movement. This podcast is my commitment to serve as an intergenerational bridge and galvanize change by having honest conversations about identity, the social construct of race, racism, and social justice. Welcome to Roots of the Spirit. Welcome to the Roots of the Spirit podcast. I have a really engaging conversation coming up. If this is your first time hearing of the Roots of the Spirit podcast, welcome. You are so cordially welcome. And if you're a loyal listener and have been along with the podcast for a while, you know how much I appreciate you. And if you don't, just please know that you are what makes this podcast possible. I just really appreciate your support always. You can check out Roots of the Spirit on Facebook as well as Instagram under Roots of the Spirit. Also, you can check out my website at rootsofthespirit.com. And I'd be incredibly grateful if you like the podcast. Please go on Apple Podcasts and rate and review. A shout out to Erica Swallow, who left me a review recently. I was so excited when I saw the alert, so it really means a lot to me. Thank you very much, Erica, and all of you for being such loyal, supportive listeners. So let's dive into today's episode. I'm really excited to introduce you to Dr. Todd Mealy, who I had the privilege of interviewing. Dr. Mealy is a 20-year educator at both the secondary level and in higher education. For 2 decades, Mealy has advocated for race consciousness in schools. He has written extensively on the topic, including the publication of 7 books. His most recent book is Race Conscious Pedagogy, Disrupting Racism at Majority White Schools. He also works as the Director of Equity and Instruction at the Bond Educational Group and serves as a diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer. It is my pleasure, without further ado, Dr. Todd Mealy. Dr. Todd Mealy, welcome to the Roots of the Spirit podcast. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Well, Spirit, thank you. I'm honored to be on the show. I can't express how excited I am to be talking with you once again. Thank you.
Thank you. As you may know, I created Roots of the Spirit podcast to galvanize change by having honest conversations about identity, race, racism, and social justice. So what a treat to have you on the show, someone who has delved so deeply into our interconnected history to make sense of our past and how that impacts our present. Someone who is literally living, practicing, and teaching anti-racism in every facet of your life. So I'm really excited for our conversation. At the top of every show, I like to briefly touch on how we met. In this instance, you and I met through one of our amazing mutual friends, Dr. Todd Allen, who is Vice President for Diversity Affairs, Professor of Communication at Messiah University in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. And that's where my mother and I were speaking last January. I can't believe it's almost coming up on a year. But anyways, he introduced us and he said, he's one of us, meaning you are someone who is an anti-racism educator and who likes to learn about history and bridge the past to the present. So it's a real treat to have you on the show today.
I'm really glad you brought up Todd. He got wind of the course I was teaching at a predominantly white high school in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He read about it in a newspaper article. Shortly after what happened at Charlottesville. And he found my contact information. He sent me an email and said, can I visit your class? And so he sat into class, and honestly, that day we were talking about restrictive covenants and housing segregation and redlining. And I think he was impressed with what he saw, and he stayed in touch with me ever since. And I was doing a little bit of work on the campus where he works, and he told me about the event with your mom speaking, and so he said, show early so you can meet, so I can meet your mother. And your mom was busy, and you gave me 5 minutes of your time, and I thought we had a good talk, and here we are now, almost a year later.
I remember Todd saying that you were in the middle of writing a book, which is at the heart of our conversation today, and I was really excited. And then just by nature of our respective background and work, I was like, this is perfect. So really excited about that. Actually, Dr. Todd Allen was one of my first guests on the Roots of the Spirit podcast, and he actually really helped shape a major pillar of the podcast. So when I mentioned to him in the interview that I had created the podcast to have honest conversations about race and racism, he said, quoting Little Rock Nine member and scholar Dr. Terrence Roberts,
you can't have honest conversations about race and racism unless you have an informed historical perspective. That really stuck with me. And so from that moment forward, I've adopted as one of my pillars of the conversations to do my part to dig as deep as possible to continue to build my informed historical perspective, which again is why I'm really excited to speak with you. You have an incredible informed historical perspective. You're the author of 7 books, including your newest book, which we'll be diving into today, Race Conscious Pedagogy, Disrupting Racism at Majority White Schools. As I mentioned in your bio, to give a snapshot of the depth and breadth of your books and scholarship, you've written books and articles about the Holocaust, slavery, abolitionists, the Underground Railroad, Black Power, the AME Church, multiple biographies, including one, Alienated American, a biography of William Howard Day, 1825 to 1900, volumes 1 and 2, Muhammad Ali, and the list goes on. It's amazing.
Several things you brought up in that statement. One is you mentioned Terrence Roberts, Dr. Roberts. So he, as you're familiar, he wrote the foreword to the book that we'll discuss. But he and I met back in 2007. I was putting on an event for the 50th anniversary of the Little Rock Nine. And I reached out to him to be the keynote speaker for that event. And so we flew him in from California, and we had a good 24 hours together and then stayed in touch since that event. But you mentioned the history, and that's one of the reasons, not the only reason why I ended up writing this book that we're going to discuss, but it's, I've spent 15 years of my professional life researching and writing about issues related to race and racism. And I've really followed the trajectory, from anti-slavery activism before the Civil War to the period of Reconstruction and then redemption in the second half of the 19th century, and then follow that into the Civil Rights era and then Black Power era, all the way to contemporary America. So I've really taken a deep dive into the history behind all of these issues, which has formed the context for what I wrote now. And I wanted to move away from history writing. I'll return to it at some point, but I wanted to move away from writing history and do something that was, I don't know what the proper way to phrase it is, but more impactful in the profession, my teaching profession, and the students that I'm working with. So I'm glad you mentioned that history. Thank you.
The history is so important because you have that foundation from which to build from. I always, in my work, talk about the fact that we have to have that understanding in order to understand what's going on today. And if we do have that understanding, what is happening today makes perfect sense because we've constructed this society and these systems that bring us to this moment. And so I just think that it's amazing. And as someone who has been, doing my best to build my informed historical perspective, sometimes I take for granted that this isn't necessarily common knowledge. Mm-hmm. The history of enslavement, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement. So that's profoundly important to bringing to the conversation in a contemporary sense about racism. So I just want to recognize that you've been building for decades.
Yeah, well, and I think I got to the point where I can write about contemporary topics, particularly in the field of education, because of that history work that I've been studying. And what I find, Spirit, is a lot of the stuff that is said today on these issues. Folks were saying that, in the periods of time surrounding the Civil War. So really the discussion is not new. The framing of it is new, but the vision and the initiatives that civil rights pioneers were undertaking in these different time periods, it does measure up to the same things we're battling with today.
I think that's also equally important to acknowledge. So your experience is just amazing. You're an adjunct professor in the history department at Dickinson College and work as director of equity and instruction at the Bond Educational Group. You recently founded the Equity Institute for Race Conscious Pedagogy, advancing anti-racist scholarship to help educators center race in the curriculum, which I'm really excited to talk about. But before we dive into that, as well as your book, another one of my podcast pillars is Sankofa. In essence, going back in order to come forward. So I'd like to talk about your upbringing and anything that you'd like to share about your family roots.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So I was born in Bradford, but raised in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So the capital city of Pennsylvania. I had a really diverse upbringing, But as we both know, diversity alone doesn't give you the tools and the knowledge to deal with inequity and to understand it. So I was really fortunate in the diverse background, both being from the city and the schools I went to. But the really what got me into this work was the experience of one of my siblings. I have a sibling, a sister who is Korean. My brother and I, so there's three of us. And my parents included, we all assumed that she was just experiencing the same things that we experienced growing up. She had her last name. People would come over to the house, and everybody inside the house spirit was treated the same. And then we assumed whenever we would leave the home that we all had very similar experiences in terms of the way people treated us and how the system worked for us, the education system, sports, going to our jobs. And that wasn't the case for her. And there was a point about a little over 20 years ago, where she was going through what I now understand is like a racial and ethnic identity crisis, meaning that she hit a point of her life where she had a racial awakening and she was dealing with things, and she had no one to go home and talk to about that, because we had established spirit of colorblind household. The thought that if we assume that everybody has the same experiences and everybody is the same, then there's not an issue that needs to be dealt with if we just ignore these inequities that exist in what my sister was dealing with. So there was actually a detachment that occurred for a year, maybe a little bit over a year. And it was during that time when I started to do studies about civil rights history. And for that's when it clicked to me, that my sister was dealing with, being treated as a perpetual foreigner. At the same time, also being treated in the monolith that we know as the model minority myth. I just feel like as a sibling, I was failing her. So that's what lit a fire for me to get into this particular field. At the same time, I have an athletic background. I coached. I've recently retired, but I coached football, high school football, for 22 years. And a lot of the stuff that you and I will probably talk about today, I was seeing on my own on these football teams that I was coaching. All these equity gaps that exist in school systems also exist on sports teams. The talk about creating a sense of belonging with students, with people at your place of employment. I saw that happening on the sports teams, even when I played it years before that. So that kind of just shaped my mind to the point where I'm at today. And then finally, Spirit, I now have, my wife and I have two children, age 6, and our son is age 6, our daughter is 3. I've seen this country's racial divides at the macro level, meaning the national news. I've seen it at the historical level in the research that you mentioned. I've seen it at the micro level in schools. So I know it's my responsibility to raise my kids, my wife included. So our responsibility for our kids to be socially conscious, to be proactive and forthright with how our children develop, not just physically and emotionally, but also with their social understanding of what other people are going through. And that's what I take from my background and the dealings with my siblings and everything else I've been involved in.
Thank you for sharing that. One of the key questions that I love to ask my guests about is about the awareness of race. And I'm glad you can see me, so you can see my gigantic air quotes, because full acknowledgement of the mythology of race and the creation of it as a social construct. But my question is, when is the first time that you became aware of race?
I could talk about this for a while. I'll try to be as succinct as I can. I lived in the city of Harrisburg, but I lived on the edge of it. And one of the first planned developments, a place called Bellevue Park. Now, it sits right across the street from Harrisburg High School, the city high school. My siblings and I did not go to Harrisburg School District. At the time, the district was going through some things where it got taken over by the city. My parents are public school folks, but just what was going on in the city at the time, my parents wanted to send us to a private school. So we went to the private Catholic school in Harrisburg. But all my friends, they lived deeper into the city. So I would travel back and forth from my house to my friend's house. And we did a lot of walking in the city, so it wasn't so much we were getting driven to our friend's house that all lived in the suburbs. We just walked to each other's houses in the city. So I would notice right away the lack of investment or the devaluation of the neighborhoods where my friends lived. And then I would go back in my neighborhood and I would see it much differently. So like that value gap that Eddie Glaude has written about a couple years ago in Democracy in Black, like I didn't have a language for that until I read his book, but that's basically what I was sensing as I was in my adolescence and in teenage years. There's times when I was with friends and racial slurs would be directed at them. or sometimes the racial slur will be said to me about the people I was with. So all of this is happening when I'm, 13 years old, 12, 13, 14 years old, heading into high school. So those are my first experiences. So my racial awakening, in that sense, occurred probably later than some of my friends, but pretty much the start of my teenage years. Again, in that sense, but I still had a lot of flaws, as you know, because you do this work for so long, Spirit, that you know that anti-racism is an ongoing thing. So you really challenge yourself every single day on it. So I clearly had more challenges to do and understand it, but I knew that early that there wasn't anything funny about racist jokes or anti-Semitic jokes or sexist jokes. Although I never really responded to that kind of humor at a young age, and I think it was because I had an awareness of my environment.
So you mentioned that you were raised to be colorblind, and you speak about that in your book and in your work, and how colorblindness can be a hindrance to really facing racism head on. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, so colorblind, the idea of colorblindness is really the biggest obstacle for someone like yourself, myself, to get above the hurdle when trying to connect with people. I mean, what do you do? There's two things I often think of. What do you do when you've heard your entire life, all men are created equal, when talking about the Declaration? And what do you do when your teachers your whole life get to the point of class where you're talking about the civil rights movement or Martin Luther King, and you hear the phrase, to paraphrase, but I want to be treated by the content of my character, not the color of my skin. So what do you do when you hear those two phrases you're white and you hear them your entire life? And both of them give the facade that color blindness is the best approach to deal with people from non-dominant and racialized groups. I don't think Martin Luther King Jr. was meaning in his phrase that he didn't want people to see his color. I think he legitimately was saying, I want you to judge me by the content of my character, but still see me as a Black American, right? So we get we meaning most white folks. I don't want to categorize every white person as being the same, but most white folks, we hear these things all of our lives, and no one ever challenges that and makes us think differently about those two phrases. And so we hit a point of our lives in adulthood, perhaps, or maybe even in high school, where then becomes difficult to really listen and hear what your friends of color are saying, that they have different experiences because their neighborhoods are policed differently than your neighborhood is policed. So it's difficult to understand it. So there are flaws embedded in color blindness, meaning that the tenets of color blindness is marked with European or white cultural standards, that those values and approaches to life end up getting gilded as universal values as opposed to a factor of white supremacy. Color blindness disguises white supremacy, as you know, because it's white people in power that establishes these standards. So the local languages and the local culture and the local identities and the histories, colorblindness neglects all of that by forcing upon folks of non-dominant groups assimilation. As it pertains to education, the practice of colorblind teaching or pedagogy shifts attention to individual behavior rather than looking at the institutions or the policies. So people see racism as an individual thing, to look at the Ku Klux Klan or the skinheads or the alt-right, as opposed to institutional structure. And colorblindness really presents a surface level or cursory perspective that the reason we study history is so we don't repeat mistakes made in the past. And then there becomes nothing critical about that approach to teaching and learning. And we therefore never learn how to address injustice, since injustices have, I'm doing your thing with the air quotes, apparently worked itself out over time. So the mindset is, one last time to return to my life experiences, if you don't acknowledge someone's race, then that problem will go away. And that's problematic, as you know. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. That's problematic because if I teach my children to not see color, if I teach my students to not see color, then they'll come away or come to think that then there's something wrong with not being white.
And then the conversation ends right there. There's no need to have any critical analysis because we're done.
Yeah.
That's it. We're colorblind and we're just going to stay there. And there's no need to look at the institutional elements of it. I mean, so many thoughts are coming to me. In particular, Dr. D'Angelo's work around a chapter in her book, White Fragility, on generalized whiteness and how being white is not seen as racialized. And so the consequences of whiteness are not examined as the consequences of being Black or being of color are a lived experience and examined. So you have that thought running through my mind. And also, if you can't see my color, then how could you acknowledge my experience in life? And how could you believe that there is an experience when I tell you that there is? And it makes me think about a lot of different things.
You're making me think about a lot of different things too. I mean, you cross the intersections and you say, you can say the same thing about sex and gender. Males might not see what women go through in board meetings and in school and discipline and everything else because they haven't experienced it. And if it was something that I didn't experience, again, we're talking race or gender or sexuality, then those things don't exist because I haven't witnessed it myself. Much of the stuff we're talking about right now, because you mentioned D'Angelo and what she's talking about. I mean, the ultimate privilege is the fact that white folks don't have to think about how their race is going to impact their day. I don't have to think about, when I wake up in the morning, the space I'm going to go into is dominated by other white people. The school, the shopping mall, the sporting event, we're talking pre-COVID here, but just to speak hypothetically. So I don't have to think when I go into these spaces. But the few times then when I'm challenged, and I've had them, and this has all helped, when I am the minority in the room, I'm conscious of that. I'm conscious of what my behavior, what kind of attention that is going to bring to me. But there's very few times in my life when I've sensed that. So, I mean, that's what you're bringing up.
Yeah, and you talk about white spaces, and I think it's important to acknowledge white spaces and how they permeate one's entire livelihood, from the home, the neighborhood, the school. I've heard you speak about the importance of acknowledging white spaces and how that presents itself, how that manifests itself and impacts our life experience. Can you talk about the importance of acknowledging white spaces?
Yeah, what you're not finding there is a lot of cultural diversity. You've talked about race as a construct about 10 minutes ago. You mentioned that. And so going back 100 and 125 years ago, when all these different European nationalities were blending together into what we now know today as whiteness or the white race, there on the surface becomes the absence of that cultural or that ethnic diversity. So here's the things that Irish folks celebrate. Here are the things that Italian folks celebrate. Here are the things that German folks celebrate, and so on and so forth. So that is missing. And since that celebration of that cultural diversity becomes missing from these spaces like a school or whatever else you can imagine, then when there is a celebration of another form of ethnic diversity, then a lot of white folks ask the question, why does that exist when I'm not seeing this for me? Okay, so that's what you're speaking to right now, and that goes back to the whole notion of making it difficult for white folks to really accept and appreciate, to acknowledge the existence of racial barriers that exist in America's various institutions that we have.
That's really interesting you mentioned that, because one of the interesting aspects of my life is I grew up in a predominantly white town, and my brothers and sisters received a lot of discrimination and racism. And what ended up happening is my parents split up, and a couple of my siblings and I moved with my mother to Ottawa, Canada, and it was incredibly multicultural. And for me, that was an oasis, because I was among so many different ethnic groups, and there was so much culture and different languages, and it was amazing. And in particular, at that specific time, because in Canada, there had been an opening for different immigrant groups to be welcomed to Canada. So it literally changed my entire life. I'm just thinking about that as a frame, in terms of, you might not have that configuration of classroom, but the information is there that we can share about the globe and our different ethnicities and customs and cultures, and how important that is to the conversation. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay, so let's talk about your book, Race Conscious Pedagogy, Disrupting Racism at Majority White Schools. I just love the way you start off your book, especially in light of what I just mentioned, describing an experience with your son, Carter. I think it really sets the tone for how to model honest conversations with children and adults alike. Can you please share that experience with my listeners?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my son and I have pre-COVID. The moment he turned 2 years old, he and I go to the movies, and we had done this for like 2 years at this point, but we never caught something to eat like dinner before the film. I just kind of time it up so we missed the previews because that's another 20 minutes, and you have a 4-year-old sitting there. You want to maximize the time that you're in the theater. But anyway, I intentionally took him to a Chinese restaurant, and I had been there a number of times, and I know that everybody, all the servers in there, their English is a second language. And my sister, who I've mentioned, is Korean, but she speaks English. She doesn't have an accent. So this was going to be the first time he was really going to hear an accent. So I kind of predicted what would come out of his mouth. And so we sat down, and the waitress came over and asked us for the meal. And right away, he said to me, "Daddy, she sounds funny." And she's standing right there. And most parents, white parents, would really shush him. But again, this was premeditated, and so my initial reaction to him was, "Yeah, and that's a beautiful accent, isn't it?" And that gave us an opportunity after we placed our order to talk about the language. And I took my phone out, and I pulled up a bunch of video clips from China and also the Chinese language, Mandarin and such. And we had a conversation about all of that, for the 20 minutes before we saw the film. So this was my first attempt at him at his age to feel like that it was okay to acknowledge people with their their different accents and ultimately different skin colors and everything else. So that's what that story was all about. The idea about conscious raising.
I feel like it's a tangible example of setting the tone for the book and the work that you do, and modeling what we as people who strive to be anti-racist need to pay attention to. I think that 9 times out of 10, it's embarrassing, it's shameful. Everyone wants to just calm that moment down, try to move away from it as quick as possible, but you're leaning into it with your children, with your family, and in your work.
So think about what shushing really means, right? So you play a game of hide and seek. I play a game of hide and seek with my kids, and so now our daughter doesn't find us. We don't want to get caught doing something, or you have some big animal coming towards you, and you're worried about getting hurt. So make sure this doesn't see us. So now if you're now doing that when your son says, "Why does he have brown skin?" And you say, that's saying something to the child that there's something wrong with that. Our skin is white, his skin is brown. There's something wrong then, so I'm going to shush that. So that's the subtext of that whole story,
which I think is beautiful.
So now in the household, because our daughter is 3, we have a number of baby dolls of color. So we have black and brown baby dolls around, and in fact, we're filming this a little bit before the Christmas holiday. Our elf on the shelf is an elf of color that we have, that I believe my father-in-law bought for us just because of the habit that we have around the household.
And that's another one of my pillars, is representation. Mm-hmm. I think that it's so important. When I look around the world, like whether it's on social media or in a store or online, and I just see the beautiful diversity represented. And I think back to my childhood, on maybe there was one doll that was black or brown, and it was just a complete anomaly. And what that does to a young girl's subconscious. I think that's really important, like representation for all children, to see children from around the world in different colors, different languages. I just think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree.
So let's dive into your book. First things first, can you please describe the definition of race conscious pedagogy?
So race conscious pedagogy, I'd like to preface my response with this statement. In schools, the biggest barrier to reaching every student that sits in our classroom is ideological. Everyone in education talks a good game about inclusionary practices. But what's really head scratching is that for as much as educators decide to enter this field because they love children or because they feel it's rewarding to work with students. Race seems to be the barrier that no one touches. So while we have practical strategies to create inclusive classrooms, sadly, there are too many educators that don't believe in this approach. In some cases, you have administrators that kind of feign equity. There are principals that kind of fail in their duties to tell the teachers to teach with an equity lens and implement certain practices. And then you have teachers that receive the practical equity strategies and skills, but never the emotional investment in those strategies. So you just have people in every level of education not investing in this. So that's why I say it's an ideological problem. So race conscious pedagogy is an approach to teaching and learning that tries to disrupt this apprehensive and race evasive behavior by the educator. As an educator, I have no control over how a school district or school building implements equity practices. And when I say equity practices, usually there's like 4: data, practices, family and community engagement, discipline, and then whether resources are being fairly and justly distributed. What I can control, spirit, is my classroom. So I can make my classroom an inclusive space. So what I've done is frame everything that I do with a critical race lens. So I teach my students with a critical race lens. I write my curriculum with the same lens, and I tailor my teaching style with a critical race lens, to use my discipline to scrutinize institutional racism. So I think there's 3 ways to now simplify the explanation of what race conscious pedagogy is. There's 3 ways to it. One is the curriculum. So the content and the skills that are being taught. So the content is driven by deconstructing institutional racism. The skills are driven toward having students do service projects. And with that, what I try to do in writing that curriculum is provide students 2 things, not really my phrase, I'm not taking credit for this phrase, but it's windows and mirrors. So you try to create windows in your classroom for white students so they can see the various cultural history and cultural diversity that exists. So they're getting that. And then the mirrors for students of color. So it's not just a representation to make sure we talk about, the history of things like the civil rights movement, and here was slavery, and here's the abolitionists, here's Jim Crow, and here's what civil rights workers did. But it's other stereotype busting representations in class. So it's people of color and women and gay folk in positions of leadership, beyond just trying to dismantle, discriminatory structures. The second part is the pedagogy. So these courses are text-based, and they provide counter voices to the presumptions and the stereotypes that the students already have. Also, the way that these courses are taught, is that everything is democratized. So it empowers the student voices. It takes away the authority of the educator instead of standing in front and lecturing all the time. It's text-based. So we read the text, we base our conversations and the learning on the text, but that allows the students the opportunity to make their personal connections with them. And in that way, that's the diversity of thought that's now being represented. So even in majority white schools, where you might have a classroom of 30 and 5 students in that classroom are students of color, that allows really the window to be open for students of color to share their experiences, but also the diversity among white folks too. You have a white Jewish student, right, would now be sharing an experience that the white Christian student would have never heard before. So everything becomes democratized. And I think that's how is another way that you work the diversity into that. And because of that democratized approach, you're seeing students feel empowered, or therefore included, or they feel that sense of belonging in your classroom. And everything is driven towards fixing things. So everything is driven towards critical thinking, to not accept the status quo, in a way to try to perfect our society. Finally, the third part of race conscious pedagogy is influencing your colleagues. So to be the leader in your school building, to try to build a culture of racial equity, but then also intersectional equity.
Wow. So now I have a million more questions. So I'm trying to think. You've described a variety of different scenarios in your book, but can you kind of paint a picture? What does that look like in a classroom? Like, what's an example of a conversation or subject matter or a text that you've read? How does that unfold? What does it look like? What is the learning experience for the young people?
Mm-hmm. First of all, let me say that race consciousness can be embedded in any discipline. So this just does not apply to a history class or any social studies class for that matter. My hope is that we see teachers across disciplines developing their courses right in their curriculum with a race conscious lens. And it's not going to look the same. A math class will be different. It's more the teaching style in a math class than it is a history class. But that said, in my classes, so what I've done is I break the course into various units that address different ethnic groups in the country. So instead of making a course about one racial or ethnic group, we cover it all. So we open up with an examination of whiteness, and then we go to an examination of African American studies, then Latinx studies, then Asian American studies, and Native American studies, etc. We have units on Jewish American studies and Islamic American studies as well. But what I'll do, let's just take whiteness for instance, because that seems to be the theme of our conversation. So to teach a topic like white privilege, you might imagine, you do the work, you know how contentious that could be if approached a wrong way, right? Because you're gonna have people feel like they're being attacked. The beauty of this kind of work in a classroom is that Spirit, that the work has to be sustained. You can't walk into a group, an organization, and do one talk with them and affect any change. That's not going to happen. It has to be sustained. And you're not going to get people to buy in that are otherwise resistant to the work that you're trying to do. So the beauty of having a class like this is that it becomes a sustained conversation. So you can throw resources that the students will read and then discuss those resources. So if you take like white privilege, I don't start teaching white privilege. I actually start with race as a construct. So I'll work to privilege. So what I'll do with race as a construct is I'll put in front of them a number of sources. Usually it's around 5 or 6 sources. And some of those sources, most of the sources are talking about race is socially constructed, and here's how. But there's also about 2 sources, maybe more, that are people that disagree with that argument. So they're getting both sides here in that sense. But we're able to look at those sources and then have conversations, and that conversation focuses on the notion of civility, how people are behaving and how certain groups might be attacked. I mean, if you take a look at the decision over the death penalty the other day and compare that to other cases of white folks who have been indicted or charged that aren't facing the death penalty, for taking life, that speaks to civility. I use in my class the story of Serena Williams, who lost to Naomi Osaka in 2018, and how she was treated by the media for her your air quotes here, her lack of civility on the court. Whereas a lot of white men tennis players have done the same thing she did and were no way called what she was called. But that's just an example. So we're looking at civility, we're looking at manifest destiny, just a total disregard of the people on the continent as folks were moving, to the West Coast. And then this myth of the melting pot. And what that myth of the melting pot, which is colorblindness today, without calling it that, the idea that we have all these different cultural groups represented in a country, and they willingly melted into this Americanness or whiteness. And that's not the case. But the idea is, if someone who doesn't measure that standard, they become, now we get to talk about othering. So they become racially othered. So that's the progression through race is something socially constructed to create a caste system, which I know you have talked about in the past in your previous shows. But all of that creates a caste system. It creates hierarchies, both with intelligence and athletics, and who the prize winner of the household is, what beauty means, all of that stuff. We've created all these caste systems that are racially driven, and you have to understand how all that became socially constructed. That allows me to then move to something more specific, and that's like talk about the 1 drop rule. So now I throw sources in front of them where we discuss the 1 drop rule through history. And now if I had students that didn't really believe race as a construct, in spite of the previous conversation, now we have these actual state laws, that defined what race was. Well, what constitutes blackness, right? In the 1 drop rule. And so now there starts to be this shift in their thinking about this idea. And when we finish that discussion about race as a construct, othering, the caste system, the 1 drop rule, I give them a formula and I say, well, what does this do? Civility plus social categories, your caste, equals privilege. And like, I don't just give that to them, they figure that out on their own. So now if you have people that didn't necessarily believe that race was socially constructed, they see it not just through the scholarship, but now examples. They didn't know how othering works. They see it. If they didn't believe the caste system worked, they now see that. And if they didn't believe in privilege, this notion of white privilege, they now see that all of that comes to create privileges that exist. I don't know if I directly answered your question, but that's what came to mind when you.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking of myself sitting in that setting and just thinking about my own evolution of understanding. And as much as my mother, as a civil rights veteran, spoke about, the importance of A, B, and C, it was literally sitting in an auditorium at a Black History Month event, hearing from Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, and he literally broke down all, like basically everything that you're saying, broke down the structure and strategy behind engineering the system. And I remember myself and my peers walking out of there, just our minds blown, because now that I'm an educator and I speak to young people, they feel really cheated, and I felt cheated. So I'm wondering, what do the students tell you about their experience in being in that setting and having that amazing understanding and transformation of knowledge?
So I have an assortment of students in the class. Most students that take the class are white. Most of them are female. I have a large number of students of color in there, but just most of the students are white because of the school that I'm in. So they walk out of the course with different experiences. Let me say first, they take the course for different reasons. Some students take the course for the content, right? They want to talk about these topics. Other students take the course because I mentioned before, it's like project driven. So that means that they're putting together basically dissertation defenses, 2 of them by the end of the year. They want to learn how to do that. So they want to learn how to properly read. They want to learn how to properly research and properly write. They also want to learn and get experience public speaking. So I have students that take the class for that reason, and I have students that take the class for both, to get both out of it. When they leave, more of the liberal-minded students in the class, they express their appreciation for the course giving them language to talk about things that are in their heart and on their minds, and they don't know how to articulate themselves. So they get the language to do that, and also sustain their own education. For conservative conservative-minded students that take the course, they also leave the class very positive. In some way, their skills at educating themselves in their particular position, they can do that because again, we're here's a voice, here's a counter voice, here's a voice, here's a counter voice. So they understand that concept of developing an argument. But what they find themselves, and not getting too specific here on the record, but what they find themselves is understanding these issues differently, and whether they say it now or later, they may say it later, is that their positions on these particular topics do change. So they become more open to having conversations with people and understanding that that experience is a lot different. It doesn't change like their political party. This class doesn't do any of that, which is the perception from the outside, as you know this because of a recent executive order. So the course is not designed to change that, and that's not at all what happens. But when it comes to these issues, you have students of all backgrounds and any political leaning. They're being informed on this, and they see that, man, the evidence does exist that tells me that these inequities, the arguments over these inequities are legitimate arguments.
So you speak about the backlash that comes along with creating these spaces, race conscious classrooms.
Yeah.
What does that backlash look like, feel like? How do you deal with it?
Well, in a way, I'm fortunate. I do come from a coaching background, and as a head coach, you have to have thick skin. So when you invest in this work, it's the price you pay. So the backlash is the price you pay. So let me first position myself. Anything that I experience, any backlash that I experience, any complaint that is made of me is nothing in comparison to what people of color have experienced in the country, both personally and systemically. So I recognize that. But still, when I have a member of the community or a parent of a student or someone attack the work that I do, it still stings a little bit, as if it's dismissive of 20 years of the work I've been doing in this field, So really, it's I talk with my wife about it. I get it off my chest and I'm able to sleep, When what I see is that's your case in point of fragility. When you're having someone criticize the work that you're doing. It's funny because it's not funny. It's sad because the people that criticize these courses, the courses I teach, I've taught this course that you're asking about for 4 years now. They're not in the class. The people are from the outside. So it comes from everybody from the outside, as opposed to anyone that sits in the classes that I teach, or even the trainings that I give. They're not going to say that Todd Mealy is un-American or Todd Mealy is divisive. They're not going to say that. But people from the outside that aren't sitting in the sessions that you give, or anyone in others classes that are being taught like this, they're not going to say that these things are un-American or divisive.
Really interesting. Our spouses deserve awards.
Right. Yes, you do the same thing.
On that note, I'm in constant conversations with educators and parents, and really anybody who's interested in becoming involved in uprooting racism. And so in my experience, for Black people and people of color, this is a lived experience. So it's not a choice to be involved in this work or to have these difficult conversations and talk to their children very openly and candidly about current events and what's going on. But for many white teachers and parents that I speak to, there's a choice to engage or not. For those who do want to engage, many say they don't know where to start. That is a very common conversation that I engage in. And based on what you just described, you have invested decades of work and you really understand racism and the construction of racism, and therefore the way in which to go about reverse engineering it or bringing about an understanding or an awareness or a comfortability about even just speaking about it. So that being said, what is your advice to anyone really, but in particular, white teachers who say they don't know where to start?
Number one, realize that this is going to take a significant amount of one, self-reflection, and two, education, because race is so nuanced. It is not as simple as many folks might think. Like, you can't read one book by Ibram Kendi or George Yancey, or Terrence Roberts and think you got it figured out. It's going to take some reflecting on where you stand on these issues, and then go and read about these various issues, but over and over again. So it's sustained. I think we said at the top of your show about how anti-racism is ongoing. So even I've been thinking and reading and studying and speaking on this for 2 decades, but I still learn, and I still I proactively, find the literature and read it and continue to educate myself, even about stuff that I'm familiar with. I want to read and listen to it and watch shows on it continuously. So it really is going to take that. So the self-reflection and the sustained education, and then see if you can find some people at that point that would serve as more of a coach for you. I think not a mentor, but a coach, so someone who might be willing to give you some skills and some advice, some tools on how to be this race conscious educator, and then check in. That's what a coach does. So they teach you the skills and they let you go and do it, and then they give you feedback. So if there are people willing, and there are people that are willing to do that, then that becomes the approach there. And then finally, the recognition that the work you're going to do is not. It's not easy. And it's not easy, and the students that right away will see through any type of anything that you're doing that's not sincere. You can't fake things like hip hop pedagogy, which is not at all what I do. But it was a recent conversation I was having with someone, so that just kind of popped in my mind. Just because you have students that are interested in that particular topic and you want to incorporate it in a classroom, but you're not really familiar with it, that wouldn't be the right approach. But I think by investing in the texts, that will allow you to direct conversations in the classroom and the level of learning that happens in the classroom if you're concentrating most of what you do on the text. Your lesson plans are based on that. Your discussions are based on the text. And that should make someone's job easier that's trying to do this for the first time.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Racism is so powerful. And one of the ongoing themes that I'm hearing and seeing, especially with, our newfound reckoning with racial injustice, is just how damaging racism is to everyone, white people included, and just the obliviousness that it creates, and kind of the fish in water, not knowing water is not a part of your awareness until it's taken from you. And I really don't have a question, but just in reading your book, I feel like you're tackling that issue in terms of trying to create that awareness, but I'm still trying to put my finger on, like, really creating an awareness around the self-awareness of whiteness and how that manifests itself. And then the next train of thought that comes in for me is Dr. D'Angelo again, which she speaks about, there's a problem in thinking that having an inherited racism, which, we're all breathing the fog, means you're a bad person. And therefore there's like a hindrance to accepting it, acknowledging it, and being able to speak about it with any level of comfort. So yeah, not necessarily a question, but just something that popped into my head. And so
I think I have a lot to say to what you were doing, and I'll try to keep this also succinct. Let me give you a little bit of history first. So the origins of white supremacy, white supremacist groups, the KKK, 1865, goes dormant after 1872. It comes back in 1915. It worked to protect a government that was exclusive. Jim Crow policy, lynching law, immigration restriction, from Eastern Europeans. And then the civil rights movement changes the approach of white supremacists. Since the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 65, now supremacist groups, which is a lot more than the KKK now, they see the government as the enemy. And now the government is now, at least on the surface, now racially and governmentally inclusive. So to be willing to hold racial sensitivity training and equity professional development, it's willing to have affirmative action policy. It's willing to have laws guaranteeing the enforcement of the 14th Amendment, the 15th and 19th Amendment as well. To have laws protecting religious diversity and LGBTQ diversity. That's how white supremacy has changed. In the process, and I'm going to say something here that will take a lot of white listeners perhaps to really ponder upon, of how dangerous it has become. So the idea of keeping the status quo, how dangerous that is. White supremacy argued could be at fault for the fact that we cannot develop a healthcare system that really treats the needs of all people. And if you take a look at these different institutions and potential policies that could be placed, why is there a delay on things that would be for the betterment of all people in this country? Health reasons, mental health reasons, physical health reasons, and we just can't jump the hurdle on these things. The Civil War was fought to maintain slavery. It resulted in the death of 600,000 people. Other wars have been fought over racism. So that's, I think, what you're getting at with your comment, about, what exactly is whiteness and white supremacy doing to all people. In a way, it's killing folks, and it's not just killing Black and brown folks, it's killing white allies that are involved in the freedom struggle, but it's also killing white folks that don't pay attention to these racial issues, that refuse to kind of listen to people that are offering life-saving things that would otherwise benefit all people, economically too.
So to the naysayers, what would you say to someone who is not fully on board with the fact that racism hurts us all?
Well, as I mentioned before, I don't think you could jump into a crowd of people, a crowd of naysayers, and convince them right away. I do think that over time, what you do is find a way to make one of these issues personal to them. And when it becomes personal to them, then they're really opening to get beneath the surface and exploring these issues. I mean, heck, look at the story that I talked about with my sister, and then also what I'm trying to prevent my children from doing. That was personal to me. So I grew up in a diverse neighborhood. I had these feelings that racist humor wasn't funny to me, but yet I was still a colorblind individual. So it took something personal to really waken me up to what you're asking me about. So to these issues. So that's what I think you do to these naysayers. You find a way over time where it becomes personal for them. And then Spirit, you empower them. So you find a way to make them part of the group making the decisions. You make them a stakeholder in this. And now that they're invested in that way, two things will happen. They'll continue to learn about the topic because they're now working with a group of people and they're asked to be part of the leadership. And two, those other naysayers that may be following that individual, they see that individual working for progress. So now that those followers may now turn the corner as well. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Can I ask you a question here?
Absolutely.
For just the moment here, let me be a contrarian for a brief moment and ask this question. Is it reasonable to get everyone with all of our thoughts on this and how important these topics are to the two of us, and your listeners can chime on this maybe later in social media, but is it possible to expect every American to learn the history of anti-Black racism? I'll answer that, but I pose that because that's the subtext of really your comment and your question here too. Is it possible for us to get to the place where we can get every person to learn the history of anti-Black racism, where we can make real progress to change the institutional structures across the United States? I'm not saying tomorrow, but over time. What do you think?
It's my hope. It's my hope that these conversations and these topics and these elements of humanity that are so crucial to our everyday lives and existence would one day deem the recognition and support of the importance of knowing math, algebra, of knowing, these subjects that we deem so crucial and critical and central. In my experience, in my life experience, in my professional experience, in my educational experience, this is, I would argue, in some ways more important than some subjects that are considered core curriculum. Yeah. And so, I mean, that's my hope. Yeah. Because I feel like it's a key to unlocking our interconnected nature and how detrimental to our humanity these divisions and this oppression is. So that's the way I look at it. Is it possible? I feel like we're up against incredible forces to make that happen, but it's my hope. Because when I speak to young people, I'm looking at like fresh faces, and there's young people, Black, white, they're so eager and excited to learn. And they have this moral compass that's so pure and so fresh. And they know right from wrong. They know fair from unfair. And so it's almost like we need to look to children as an example.
I love that you said children. I totally agree with you. I wanted to ask that question just to put your listeners, have them think about this as well. I do think there's people that we won't be able to reach. Just to be realistic, there are
absolutely.
We won't be able to reach. But if the last 4 years showed us anything, is that we need to, this anti-intellectualism we've been in 4 or 5 years here shows us that we need an educated populace. While I think that's a good question about, is it realistic that we can educate everybody on these topics? You have to try something different. And I think also that's the sports background in me. If something's not working, you're not going to continue to do the same thing. You're going to change it and try something new. Even if it doesn't work, you're still going to try something new. So I think we've seen that we need an educated populace here. I want people to be informed. I think education is, the school system is how this needs to be done. History itself gives us the rounding to understand a lot of these issues and helps us think critically about such topics. But high school, is perhaps, college is too late. And colleges and universities, Spirit, as you know, they've been the first to invest in ethnic studies and gender studies and everything. But it's too late.
And that's what anti-racism work, a lot of it is unlearning. And that's hard. I was in an anti-racism workshop and we literally did this activity where we like took 2 steps forward and then to the left. And it was like this pattern. And then 10 seconds later, we were to reverse it. And it was like so discombobulating. And so it was a great analogy to how difficult it is to unlearn this deep conditioning. I'm a huge proponent. I just absolutely love analogies. And I just love, how you use your experience as a coach to describe the importance of your work. Can you just give me a snapshot of what you noticed in that realm and how you bring your experience from the sports world and coaching to your work?
Yeah. When you and I do diversity, equity, inclusion work, I think we frame everything we do with equity, and then you're seeing diversity and inclusion embedded in that. But I think we would agree with me by saying that inclusion piece is vital for changing the institutional structure of whatever who you're working with. And that would be the biggest thing that I would see with coaching is when you have people on my team that I would see their body language change over time, their investment in practices, their investment in meetings, their investment in watching film, their investment in and the off season would change when they feel like their role, they don't have a role on the team, and they feel like their presence on the team is not valued. It's like they're just taking up space. So when I would see that happening, I knew that I was doing something wrong, right? So that's this ongoing work, right? So like even though I'm invested in this work, there's still mistakes that I make. So then I would then try to address it. And so by my last 10 years coaching, one of the biggest things that I tried to do with my teams was to make sure that everybody, like, they specifically knew what their role was going to be on the team, and then to make sure that me and my assistant coaches were proactively making sure that we were reinforcing the job that the kids were doing, and we were also investing in their lives beyond the sport we were coaching them with. So make sure that we were present in the other sports that they played, or if they were in theater, we were going and watching them. So to invest in all that stuff, sometimes visiting them at work. So that making them feel included was vital to any kind of success that we were doing. And so that's the biggest piece that I was able to see and be able to carry that over into the classroom. Another aspect is the diversity piece. So, I mean, you think that sports is a place where you put race and ethnicity aside and everyone's a team. But if you're ignoring the fact that you have members of your team that are dealing with some things and you're totally negligent about what they're doing, then what happens is what we call unlearning, which happens in a classroom. So like in a classroom, if there's a teacher that doesn't respect the culture and the language and the experiences that is impacting the life of this particular student, the coach, the same thing. If there's a reason why a player is coming late, look into that reason as opposed to just punish the kid. But then also when issues come up that are national in scope and they permeate the locker room, if I'm ignoring them, there's going to be division among the team because they have their differences, because they have different experiences. Mm-hmm. So that has to be addressed. So we try to be a proactive coaching staff that wouldn't neglect or ignore issues that are happening mainstream, because they knew that they were filtering into the conversations in the locker room. And then that's the same thing with the classroom then.
That's so crystal clear to me. And I think that analogy is so applicable. And I think the visual is very powerful.
I just have a couple more questions, so I'd like your thoughts on this quote that I recently saw.
Sonia Renee Taylor, who is a poet, activist, author, and leader, a couple months ago, I was on Instagram and I saw someone post a quote that she had espoused at one of her lives or one of her events. And she said,
"I don't want an ally, because an ally means you came here to help me. How are you helping me solve the problem you caused? Why aren't I helping you solve the problem you caused? Why am I not the ally and you the actor? Why is blackness the responsibility holder and whiteness gets to be the helper?" In light of our conversation, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Because it completely flipped the narrative for me. And I feel like it's definitely in line with the work that you do.
So what happened this summer, with the unprecedented demonstrations that we saw in the spring and the summer, was that made a lot of white folks pay attention to what was going on in the world. Sitting in my seat, I'm thinking that's got to frustrate a lot of people of color, right? So that's got to frustrate a lot of Black and brown folk. That now, for the first time, white folks are acknowledging that there's something wrong. Well, what we were talking about in the summer was policing in America, but now there's something wrong with other things as well in corporate America and education. So I knew that must have been frustrating because in various ways, all these issues, whether you're listening to music or you're reading scholarship or you're watching a film, all these different avenues, these issues, Spirit, have been articulated to white America, and white America has been ignorant of all of that. And the way that I look at it, both the reaction to the George Floyd Black Lives Matter inspired protest, but then also what you just read, is that this disease of racism is in white America. Like, it was created by white Americans. It's in white America. So it should be an issue that's addressed and deconstructed and dismantled by white America. That is a driving force for what I do. Now, that understanding, I should say. But again, a lot of that understanding, occurred because not just the personal experiences, but the history that I've been researching for some time. And there's also times where I have to accept, and this doesn't frustrate me. I'm accepting of this, where people are skeptical about me. They don't know me. They're skeptical of me, deservedly so. I'm a white male, and people don't know anything about me. It's kind of like when Todd Allen, when he came to visit my class, he didn't know anything about me, and I'm sure he had skepticism. He read this article about me, but was everything in that article just performative? He wanted to see for himself if I was for real. And I know Black parents that send their children into the school system, there's skepticism behind that because there's history, that exists, that white folks don't understand. So I think that quote is spot on here, and it's deserving of a conversation in white America at large to really get, to really have everybody understand that, this war being waged against anti-Black racism, should be fought by white folks. Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned earlier, in 2020, you founded the Equity Institute for Race Conscious Pedagogy, advancing anti-racist scholarship to help educators center race in the curriculum. Can you talk about that as we're bringing our conversation to a close? And also for anyone who's listening, who I'm sure is going to be completely enthralled and interested in engaging with you, can you paint a picture of the work that you do there and how people can become involved?
Oh, so the vision for the Institute is, I've had it for quite some time now, about 7-8 years. And then I was able to really just finish up the book that we've been talking about a year ago, and then started to take steps towards launching the Institute. And so I'm a researcher. I think I'm a better researcher than I am a writer. So I want the Institute to be multifaceted. So I want to give opportunities for students, but also people interested in this kind of work, to get involved in the research so they can learn about researching that deals with anti-racist work. So that's one thing. Two is I want it to benefit educators. So I want the Institute to be able to produce resources and tools that educators can use to change either their school building or their classroom into race conscious spaces. And that when I say resources or tools, that could be from lesson planning to curriculum writing. And so we provide curriculum writing services, or going into the schools themselves and speaking with folks on how to do this work and create equitable spaces in their schools. So we want to provide those kinds of tools for educators, both classroom teachers, administrators, and whatnot. Then we also we have a publishing house to it, and there's a lot of people out there that have a lot of good ideas that have been invested in this work, but they may not be able to get their work out to the public in a different way. So they may not be able to pick up a big time publisher, because they're not Michael Eric Dyson, right? So we exist as an avenue for scholars that are invested in doing research and writing, and they want to get their work out to the public. So we want to help folks be able to do that as well. So the Institute has a major book publication. It'll be published in 2 volumes, released in 2020, the end of 2021, and then I think the end of 2022. So that's a collection of about 50 authors. So it's a chapter book, 2 chapter books, and dealing with all the topics that we hit on today. One volume will focus on classroom teachers. Another volume will focus on the stakeholders, the people making the decisions for the schools at large. So that's what the Institute does. So we're multifaceted.
That's amazing. I mean, when I think about what people can do, they can visit your website, they can look into the Institute, because I mean, even when I think about myself and the work that I do, sometimes I feel like I'm on an island, and you have created this Institute and this community to help people, collectively drive this conversation and this work forward. So I think that is incredibly important for our listeners, because I feel very fortunate to have listeners who range from people who are newly interested to this topic of conversation to middle, high school, elementary teachers, school superintendents, et cetera. And there's a big desire right now to want to become involved in all of those different levels, not necessarily knowing where to go. So that's amazing. Thank you for sharing.
The Institute will be very blessed if we ever in some way collaborate with you. So.
Well, thank you, and vice versa.
This has been such a wonderful conversation. Can you please tell us where we can find you, your website, your social media, and then I have my signature question, and you can go about your day.
Okay. So my the Institute's website is raceconsciouspedagogy.org. I have an email address at that site. It's Mealy, MEALY, at raceconsciouspedagogy.org. My Twitter handle is just Todd Mealy, at Todd Mealy. Facebook is the same, Todd Mealy. And then I have a personal website, which is toddmealy.com.
I want to thank you so very much. Your work is so powerful and so needed, so timely. I feel really lifted in having this conversation, and glad to know that you're out there doing such amazing work.
And for my final question,
Dr. Mealy, what are the roots of your spirit?
My family. So my parents, Tom and Maureen, my siblings, Tommy and Chrissy, and then my wife, Melissa, and my children, Carter and Adeline. So they're the people that motivate me every single day to do this work, but also be the best version of myself. So I do appreciate you. I really like your closing question, and good luck to you with, I know you're writing your mom's memoir and all the work you're doing. So good luck to you too.
thank you so much for such a wonderful interview and for the great work that you do.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Spirit, so much.